25 after 7. White-collar crime is on the rise in South Africa. That's according to law firm Norton's Inc., its director, John Oxenham. He says fraud and corruption in the public and private sector were widely regarded as two of the biggest threats to the South African economy. John Oxenham is on the line for us this morning. A very good morning to you, Mr. Oxenham. I thank you for your time.
Hi, good morning to you.
Very worrying stats indeed came through from the talk yesterday.
Yes, very much so. I think there's two issues really from our perspective. The seminar itself canvass views not only from private practitioners but also from public officials tasked with combating fraud and corruption. But just from an internal fraud perspective within organizations, I think we don't need to look much further than recent announcements about increasing fuel prices and food prices going up, and there's obviously a temptation from an individual's perspective. The reason why I think we've seen an increase from our own practice perspective is obviously from a firm's perspective, there's a limited amount of internal controls, or those internal controls aren't necessarily up to standard. And coupled with the temptation from an individual's perspective to commit fraud, we've certainly seen that. There's also a rather more detailed kind of fraud which is being committed and corrupt activities being committed by individuals themselves. We've also mentioned during the course of our presentation yesterday that from the way of doing business in the country, a lot of business is obviously limited to tenders or dealing with officials in the procurement environment. And from a corruption perspective, what we've witnessed certainly is that having too much individual responsibility with our controls on business themselves and also within state entities, that certainly increased the amount of corruption. And then from an individual corporation perspective, the amount of fraud itself.
You know, I'm worried about this limited amount of internal controls, because you'd imagine that there are governance rules, and even in governments, I mean, there are all sorts of regulations that are there. Is the issue compliance?
I think so. I think it's certainly a big part to play, and unfortunately, not only does the depressed economy affect individuals themselves, but it also has a role to play on what kind of spend corporations can affect within their own organizations. And I think, unfortunately, controls and compliance generally fall to the back of the queue when times are tough. And certainly in those circumstances, people obviously are aware of the fact that the controls aren't necessarily there, and when that occurs, there's a temptation and also the ability to get away with it, or the thinking that you can get away with it.
But one way of dealing with corruption, and this is scientifically proven, is to really arrest people, take them to jail. What do you think the corporate executives are doing about it? Do they turn a blind eye?
Well, not necessarily from a corporate perspective. I think there's obviously an obligation within there for internal reporting and something to be done as to whether or not errant employees have contravened the applicable legislation. But I thought what was particularly interesting during the course of the seminar yesterday is we had Willie Hoffman from the Asset Forfeiture Unit speaking as well. I think the state certainly is well equipped with the pieces of legislation. The difficulty though is this. I think the kind of levels of prosecution which are occurring are somewhat limited, unfortunately. The state, as we know, is relatively ill-equipped in terms of resources, and unfortunately doesn't have the kind of spend to commit to these very, very important areas. And coupled with, obviously, the corporations themselves' internal lax controls, it makes for a bit of a bad recipe. I don't think it's all doom and gloom, and certainly a number of corporations are trying to toe the line. Organizations like Corruption Watch have come to the fore and are certainly making strident efforts to combat this issue.
Just a final one. I'm sorry to push you there, because I would like to know what the seminar then agrees we should do in order to deal with this scourge.
Well, I think certainly an uptake in internal controls is vital. I think it's certainly, from our perspective, something which cannot be ignored. It has to be addressed, and certainly the purpose behind the seminar itself was to try and inculcate that culture within corporations, to take it upon themselves, to not bemoan your position, and, albeit there is this malaise of corruption, to do something about it themselves and to avoid becoming what we've always said is a big problem, a corruption headline.
Right, I thank you for your time this morning. John Oxenham is the director of the law firm Norton's Inc., and that brings us to exactly 7:30 for your latest updates with Mabakshini Chetty.
Safm, South Africa's news and information leader.